In this video, I want to talk about, very briefly, the context of Jeremiah's calling and his ministry. Now, there's a lot to be said about the context of Jeremiah's ministry, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. In the opening chapter of Jeremiah, verses 1 to 3, we see exactly when the prophet conducted his ministry. In those verses, we are told that Jeremiah's ministry started in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, king of Judah, and it lasted up until Zedekiah's reign, Zedekiah was the final king of Judah. Now, Josiah is noted as a great reformer in Judah. He was a truly good king, and he helped restore proper worship. As such, of course, Josiah is noted in the biblical text as being righteous and good in the eyes of God. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, right? As compared to many of the other kings who were not as faithful to the Lord. As one commentator has said, the details are a bit hazy as to whether Jeremiah helped with the reform movements, but nonetheless we can say that Jeremiah began his ministry at some point during Josiah's reign. He's at least on the scene during Josiah's reign. Before I get into the context of when Jeremiah's ministry occurred, I do want to say a few brief things about Jeremiah's calling to the ministry. Now, Jeremiah's calling is recorded in Jeremiah 1, verses 4 to 10. And there, the text says, specifically in verses 4 and 5, that the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, saying, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations." Now here we see that God's plans for Jeremiah were in place well before Jeremiah was even born. Indeed, God's calling to Jeremiah starts off by reminding Jeremiah that God knew him personally in a very intimate way before he was even conceived. And it's important to remember ourselves, I think, this is very important to remember, that our own ministries always start off, they always begin not with a mission statement, or with a plan, or some sort of method of action. No, far from it. Our ministry should always begin with the realization that God knows us personally, that God not only knows us personally, but that God loves us deeply. In other words, our ministries should always begin with the realization that we have to have a deep relationship with God. And in fact, God has already known us before we were ever born. And the question is, will we know him? So I think that's a pretty important feature in Jeremiah's calling, as outlined in those verses. Anyway, Jeremiah responds to these words with hesitation. He says that he's really in no position to be a prophet since he doesn't know how to speak well. And to boot, he's just a young kid. But you read that God gently reminds Jeremiah that God will be with him, delivering him and helping him. God says that Jeremiah doesn't need to worry about what to say or how to speak because he, God, will put his words into his mouth. Now, Jeremiah doesn't know it yet, but he will certainly need to rely upon the Lord for his strength because his ministry is going to involve many hardships. He's going to experience many trials. He's going to experience loneliness. He's going to experience depression. He's going to experience a lot of weeping. I mean, Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet, right? So he's going to need to rely upon his calling's experience, or the experience of his calling, because he's going to need to remember that the words that he's speaking, they are God's words. They're not his words. And if he's rejected because of the words he's speaking, it's not that he's personally being rejected, but it's rather that God's being rejected. And so all of these things, all of these features are very important, I think, for Jeremiah to keep in mind. And he, like all of us, is going to struggle with some of that. So I mentioned that Jeremiah begins his ministry during the time of Josiah. Now, Josiah was a good king, as I mentioned, but you have to understand that after Josiah dies, the kingdom of Judah goes into quite the nosedive. Josiah's descendants are anything but pious. They're anything but loyal to the Lord. Their actions, as a result, serve to bring about total destruction of the nation. So we read in 2 Kings chapter 23 that after Josiah's death, his son Jehoahaz became king. Now he was a wicked king, we are told. He only reigned for a mere 3 months because the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are one of the political power players of the time. But anyway, the Egyptians depose him from the throne, and in his place they put his brother Jehoiakim on the throne. Now, Jehoiakim was a terrible ruler, a wicked ruler. He shunned the things that Jeremiah had to say. At one point, in fact, Jehoiakim burned the scroll that contained the messages of Jeremiah. You can read about that in Jeremiah chapter 36. And at another point during Jehoiakim's reign, he had a prophet of the Lord killed. Jeremiah 26, verses 20 to 23. Jehoiakim was, to say the least, a completely different character than Josiah. And now through a series of events, Jehoiakim becomes a subservient king to the king of Babylon. Now another name or another title for subservient kings was the title vassal, or a vassal king. Okay, anyway, at any rate, 2 Kings 24, the first part of that chapter, records that Jehoiakim is finally deposed completely from the throne. And in his place, Jehoiakim with an N at the end, who is his son, rules. Now, his reign was pretty short, 3 months. You read about this in 2 Kings chapter 24. The reason for his short reign was because the king of the much feared Babylonian Empire came up and deposed him by taking him prisoner, sending him off into exile, along with a number of other officials and people. You can read it, of course, about this in 2 Kings chapter 24. Now, the king of Babylon put his uncle, a man named Mattaniah, on the throne, and Mattaniah therefore became king of Judah, of course, under the authority and the reign of Babylon, of course. Now Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, changed Mattaniah's name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah, by the way, is one of Josiah's sons. You could read about Josiah's descendants in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 15, and in that part of 1 Chronicles, there's a bunch of genealogies that are given and so forth. So go back and check that out. 1 Chronicles 3:15. Anyway, we read in 2 Kings 24:19 that Zedekiah was a wicked king. The text compares him with Jehoiakim, saying that Zedekiah was just as wicked as him. Zedekiah at one point rebels against Babylon, and as a result, the king of Babylon comes against Jerusalem and eventually succeeds in bringing the kingdom of Judah to its knees. And this officially marks the end of the kingdom of Judah. Zedekiah is therefore the last king of Judah. It's a real sad tale, to be honest with you. Now, what does all of that have to do with Jeremiah? Well, as I said, Jeremiah conducted his ministry during that time period, from Josiah's reign all the way to Zedekiah's. In other words, with the exception of Josiah, Jeremiah's time as a prophet was during the reigns of quite wicked and quite despicable kings. But it wasn't just wicked kings that Jeremiah had to put up with. It was also wicked officials and wicked people, even wicked religious people. For example, when Jeremiah would prophesy that the Lord was going to bring judgment upon the land for their sin, there was a priest named Pashur who beat up Jeremiah and then threw him into prison, put him in stocks. You could read about this in Jeremiah 20. And similarly, Jeremiah had to battle with false prophets. One well-known example of this occurs at the beginning of the reign of Zedekiah, the last king of Judah. There, at that time, Jeremiah had a confrontation with a false prophet named Hananiah. Hananiah was prophesying peace and restoration. He was saying that God's judgment was going to end very soon. In other words, it wasn't going to be that bad, and so everybody should just lighten up and enjoy themselves, or at least anticipate a quick end to all the trouble. Now, Jeremiah maintained that, no, in fact, it was going to be really bad. So the people, as you can very well imagine, were left with two sparring prophets who were speaking two different things. Now, most people don't want to hear a negative message. Most people want to hear a positive, uplifting, encouraging message. And so it makes sense that probably a lot of people enjoyed Hananiah's teachings and prophecies. And they probably didn't, well, we know they didn't enjoy Jeremiah's teachings at all. But anyway, Jeremiah's message was largely being negative, was one that was shunned by the people. And these other so-called prophets, these false prophets, um, even though they were giving largely positive messages, in the end, it was Jeremiah's prophecies that proved to be true, that proved to be inspired by God, and they were proven true by all the events that followed. Babylon ended up deposing Judah's king, and taking over the land completely. Okay, so Jeremiah is proven to be right. At any rate, the ministry of Jeremiah occurred during this time period of political, social, and religious upheaval. This was a time of deep uncertainty for an entire people group, an entire nation, for all of the people living in Judah, and even the surrounding nations. This was a very problematic time. You had the Egyptians, you had the Babylonians, and of course, before that, you had the Assyrians, and all in Judah. They were all going about life in chaos. Right? This was not a good time, but it was Jeremiah's time of ministry. His ministry, we can see, was marked by confrontation. It was marked by loneliness. Jeremiah's ministry was marked by frustration and doubt. It was full of questions, and we're going to see that in the next video more in depth. And yet, in light of all that, or should I say despite all of that, Jeremiah must be commended for his devotion, for his faithfulness to God. He faithfully delivered the message that God wanted him to share, even when that message proved to be something that brought about an immense amount of difficulty upon him personally. Even though it cost Jeremiah a lot, he was still faithful to the Lord and to deliver the message that the Lord had given him. There's something that we can learn from that, I am sure.